Okay. You have attendees here, just make sure. Excellent. Okay, everybody, and welcome to another presentation today here at the University of Lethbridge and at the Prentice Institute for Global Population Economy. Dr. Patrick Wilson is our speaker today, and I have to take off my glasses to read my very tiny phone because I am not millennial. He will be speaking today on Indigenous nation-to-nation and intersectoral partnership building for socio-ecological restoration. We're pleased to welcome everybody here to the Prentice Institute, which is of course located on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Appreciate the presence of everybody who has joined us here today. And those of us online, we are recording. I'm not Patrick, this is Patrick. If you're watching the video, I'm 3 times the size of Patrick. And I will then turn this over to Patrick. The floor is yours. Time for questions at the end.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Lars. Thanks for the introduction. As Lars said, my name is Patrick Wilson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. My Blackfoot name is Biamskapo, meaning man who travels far south. This was a name that was gifted to me by Dr. Mike Brewstead at a ceremony in front of City Hall in 2021. I believe one of the first, if not the first, such ceremonies to occur on the campus of City Hall. So it's a very important occasion for me. Grateful for that. I'm really happy to be here today and to have the opportunity to present progress of an emerging research project my co-applicants and I have engaged in with support from the Prentice Institute Partnership Grant. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation here. The grant was used to deepen an emerging research collaboration between myself, Cheryl Martins, who is a sociologist and director of the Institute for the Advanced Studies of Inequality at the University of San Francisco in Quito, and Lourdes Hipa, who is president and Grand Chief of the Indigenous Quijos Nation of the Ecuadorian Amazon. She's also the first female president of that organization and one of the limited number of women who have been elected as leaders of Indigenous Amazonian political organizations. Lourdes, Cheryl, and I have working relationships of different lengths and depths, but we had not worked collectively among the 3 of us until this opportunity. I have been working with leaders and members of the Quijos Nation since the mid-1990s, and this was prior to its official recognition as an Indigenous nationality in Ecuador, on themes including indigeneity, Indigenous social movements, and the history and cultural politics of development in Quijos territory. And I began collaborating with Lourdes in 2023. Separately, Cheryl had started work with Lourdes and other leaders and members of the Quijos Nation on themes of female leadership, gender-based violence, and women's sexual and reproductive health. The 3 of us commenced work collectively approximately a year ago with the purpose of developing a collaborative research partnership to advance knowledge on Indigenous land use frameworks and Indigenous leadership of relevance for questions of biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and food sovereignty and security in the Ecuadorian Amazon. In essence, processes of socio-ecological restoration. In this talk, there are 4 things I'm intending to do. First, I want to discuss some of the gaps in dominant approaches to ecosystems restoration. Second, I will outline the partnership building activities undertaken over the last year. Third, I will discuss the most recent evolution of the partnership. And last, I will reflect on some of the barriers that remain to equitable collaboration with Indigenous researchers. But first, I want to provide you a bit of context about the Quijos Nation. Their traditional territory is in the upper Amazon of Ecuador, a unique ecosystem where the eastern foothills of the Andes give way to the Amazon basin. This is considered one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, and it has been central for decades now in conservation initiatives. It is home to a wide array of plant and animal species that are unique to that region, which contributes to its strategic importance in debates about biodiversity management, even more so recently in the context of climate change. The Quijos Nation itself is comprised of approximately 25 communities in a discontinuous territory in Napo province, with most of the Quijos population concentrated in the cantones, which is kind of roughly equivalent to counties, of Archidona and Tena, as you can see on the map in the bottom left of the slide. Nauki is a recently reconstituted indigenous nationality in Ecuador, receiving formal ministerial recognition in 2013. But leaders and members of the nation trace their ancestry back to pre-Columbian Quijos chiefdoms and the Quijos chief Humandi, who led a rebellion against Spanish colonizers in 1578. There's a massive statue of Humandi, which now greets visitors to the city of Tena, the capital of Napo province. That's the statue in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And Humandi himself was declared a national hero and symbol of anti-colonial resistance by Ecuador's National Assembly in 2011. The Quijos people, like other closely related indigenous groups in this part of the Amazon, live mostly in small rural communities integrated into the forest landscape, with their subsistence practices historically based on forest gardens or chacras, the gathering of forest resources, and hunting. The overarching goals of this research collaboration, and particularly the work that has evolved from the engagement sessions under this grant, are oriented around the application of indigenous knowledge systems, or IKS, and traditional ecological knowledge, TEK or TEC, in processes of socioecological restoration and the formulation of indigenous-focused life plans. Broadly conceived, these life plans are culturally and ontologically informed land use and management plans rooted in indigenous concepts of living well and represent alternatives to state-directed planning models. As such, these plans counter an over-reliance on the natural sciences to guide understanding and regulation of biological systems by focusing on the need to amplify local ecological knowledge, biocultural heritage, and socially inscribed relationships to the land as pathways to biodiversity enhancement and sustainability, the social component of ecological restoration. This can also be framed as a question of indigenous rights, as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, highlights self-determination and the right to maintain and strengthen relationships to the land, while noting that respect for indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. And that's a quote from the UN General Assembly in 2007. Additionally, there is a growing body of research that suggests the important role of indigenous land use management and the application of traditional ecological knowledge in maintaining and enhancing tropical forest biodiversity. These studies highlight the positive association between indigenous land governance and biodiversity management, noting how the land use and management practices of indigenous peoples regularly outperform Western conservation and biodiversity programs. Thus, it is not accidental that a large proportion of the planet's biodiversity is found on traditional lands of indigenous peoples. At the same time, accelerated land degradation disproportionately affects indigenous peoples and others who rely on the land for subsistence, adding to a long history of land dispossession and extractivism that has severed many indigenous peoples' connections to the land. Concurrent with land degradation is the erosion of IKS and TEC, the very knowledge systems increasingly recognized to be crucial to biodiversity management and the preservation of ecosystems integrity, precisely because the vitality of these knowledge systems hinges on the capacity of indigenous peoples to activate them in land-based activities. The workshops we designed and executed through the partnership grant sought to integrate these issues in ways that would situate the activation and application of IKS and TEC through pursuit of greater territorial sovereignty and autonomous governance of indigenous land planning and management, with close attention paid to the gender dimensions of land use and the traditional ecological knowledge foundational to it. From the earliest stages of partnership building, the scope and content of the workshops was led by Lourdes Hipa and the other members of the Governing Council of the Quijos Nation. In the execution of the workshops, the Quijos participants drove the form and content of each workshop in keeping with Quijos values of knowledge sharing and responsibilities to community. The workshop themes were: first, Quijos territorial rights and sovereignty; second, female indigenous leadership and gender-based violence; and third, Quijos forest gardens or chagras and traditional ecological knowledge. The themes of the workshops overlapped and were interconnected, and the chagras emerged as a unifying thread. Therefore, before providing more information about each individual workshop, I would like to spend a few minutes introducing the chagras. Chagras are built into the forest landscape, a form of land-extensive horticulture, also known as shifting cultivation, where a patch of forest is cleared and cultivated for a number of years, typically somewhere between 18 and 15 years, to then be allowed to fallow, permitting forest regrowth. The gardens themselves are not clear-cut from the forest, but instead a variety of tree species and other plants that have use or aesthetic value are left untouched and encouraged to thrive in the garden setting. A typical key host garden will contain over 100 species of domesticated, semi-domesticated, and wild plants cultivated and or encouraged, with some grown as food sources for human and or human consumption, some as medicines, and some simply because they are beautiful. By providing food for a variety of forest animals, and therefore drawing the animals closer to human settlements, the gardens also contribute to the hunting economy. The key host gardens are a classic example of indigenous biodiversity management strategies whose cumulative effects are believed to be instrumental in the continued evolution of Amazonian forest biodiversity. Key host chacras, as is also common elsewhere in indigenous Amazonia, are female productive spaces, as these gardens are cultivated and maintained by women. This makes the gardens centers of female sociality and contexts in which women activate their gender-specific ecological knowledge. In contexts in which the gardens remain vital, they serve as the foundation of key host food security. A productive garden can fully provide a diverse and healthy diet for the family who tends it. So close is the association between a woman and her chakra that the forest gardens come to stand as a testimonial to women's productive labor and the physical manifestation of a woman's social being. It is in this space where women enact and transmit their gender traditional ecological knowledge through not only gardening techniques, but also by employing a corpus of ritual practices deemed necessary for garden vitality, which are woven into key host cultural and ontological systems. Lourdes Hipa suggests, for example, that the physical tasks of planting, weeding, and tending to the garden are ineffective in the absence of the accompanying ritual practices and spiritual knowledge that forge relationships between gardeners, their plants, and the garden spirits that animate the chakras. This knowledge is activated and transmitted in the physical spaces of gardens and is thus contingent on land-based practices, making the gardens themselves the laboratories where ecological knowledge can be activated. The chakra system, however, is in steady decline due to territorial fragmentation and loss of land. Maintenance of forest gardens is reliant upon a sufficient territorial base, one that allows key host women to engage in rotational gardening with periods of fallow. Lourdes Hipa and other leaders of the key host nation recognize the acute threats of territorial loss and fragmentation to key host economic autonomy, and the risk that declining chakra gardening practices will compromise key host food security and lead to a loss of key host ecological knowledge tied to gardening and related forest management practices. While some of the threats to territorial integrity date back 60 years or more, the nature and intensity of territorial loss and fragmentation has accelerated in recent years, making these issues all the more pressing for members of the key host nation and other indigenous Amazonians. So I'll turn now to providing a bit of discussion of each of the sets of workshops. The first workshops we conducted were on territorial rights and sovereignty. And in these workshops, different key host leaders and prominent key host intellectuals provided presentations on the historical and contemporary challenges members of the key host nation faced in their struggles for land rights dating back to the 1960s. I will briefly outline some of those pressures. The first and possibly most important legal transformation that led to the consistent advance of the agricultural frontier and colonization into the Amazonian region was the creation of the Law of Agrarian Reform and Colonization in 1964. This law was designed to address inequitable land distribution of agricultural land in the Andean highlands, but this was done so primarily not by breaking up large landed estates in the highlands, but rather by compelling poor and landless peasants to move to the Amazon or to move to parts of the coast as homesteaders. Under this law, to obtain legal title for land, one had to engage in productive practices that were oriented towards the market, so capitalist agricultural practices or cattle ranching. Most homesteaders opted for cattle ranching as this was the path of least resistance. So it required the least amount of labor to transform the garden, the forest into pasture, and then graze cattle on it. Accompanying the Agrarian Reform Law was another law also passed in 1964 called the Law of Wastelands, which stipulated that any land that was not being put to capitalist productive practices, essentially market-oriented agricultural production, was considered uninhabited and open to colonization, open to expropriation. This meant that essentially the entirety of the Amazon basin in Ecuador in 1964 was legally considered uninhabited, as all of the indigenous peoples in that region engaged in small-scale horticultural practices and hunting and gathering, making them deemed invisible in the legal landscape. In response to this, many indigenous Amazonians also began adopting cattle ranching in the late 1960s and early 1970s as a strategy to gain legal recognition to their territories as well. This further expanded the cutting of forest and the cattle ranching frontier. Part of the ability of indigenous Amazonians to shift to the cattle ranching economy was facilitated by the extension of agricultural credit through the Banco de Fomento, or the Ecuadorian state's agricultural development bank. Yet many indigenous Amazonians by the end of the 1970s found themselves unable to repay the loans they had taken from the bank, which ultimately led them to losing their lands, as the land was the collateral for the loan in the first place. And so that land was then sold by the banks to land prospectors, further expanding the cattle ranching frontier. Deforestation and land fragmentation is only accelerated through time due to economic pressures and other stressors. At the same time, the law of the commons presented itself as a tool for some indigenous Amazonians. This was an antiquated law dating to 1937. It was originally designed, in fact, to as a transitional means to compel indigenous peoples to work collaboratively, ultimately with the goal of making them good capitalists and having them enter into the marketplace. But it remained on the books. And so in 1936, the 1937 law permitted indigenous communities to seek title to land, not through individual property rights, but as a collective. So you could get communal title to territory. Some of the earliest communities that were formed in the aftermath of 1964 sought such communal recognition of land as a mechanism of defending themselves against internal division and fragmentation of their territory. Yet few of the communities in the key host nation obtained a communal title to land, making territorial fragmentation one of the greatest socioeconomic threats facing the nation today, and a formidable challenge to the nation's pursuit of territorial rights and recognition. A second set of threats to territorial rights and recognition is the forces of extractive industry in the region. In the immediate aftermath of agrarian reform, Texaco Corporation discovered oil in the Ecuadorian Amazon and began extracting that oil in 1967. So the era of oil in Ecuador commenced in 1967 and continues to the present. Large concessions of land throughout the Ecuadorian Amazon have been granted to multinational oil companies for exploration and, if viable, for exploitation. And this represents a further threat to territory and environment. But on top of that, oil development is accompanied by the building of road infrastructure, a network of roads in the Amazonian region to support oil activities. Those road networks serve as arteries for colonization and accelerate land grabbing on the side of newly constructed roads. So as the roads are built into the Amazon, colonizers or poor peasants from the highlands sort of flood along those arteries into the Amazon and homestead on each side of the roads, increasing territorial fragmentation, increasing forest cutting, and the expansion of the cattle ranching economy. Other forms of extractive industry followed as that basic infrastructure was built, including the development of African palm plantations in parts of the Amazon, commercial logging enterprises, and other activities that have exacerbated deforestation and territorial loss. More recently, and the most pressing current concern for the members of the key host nation is gold mining, both by legal entities and by informal illegal gold miners. which has led to contamination of land and watersheds and a rapid spike in the threat and actual use of violence against people in the region. Many Quijos families, either out of economic need or out of fear of reprisal, have accepted payments in exchange for permitting miners to conduct mining activities on their lands. Some of the insights emerging from this first set of workshops included the pressing challenges associated with land fragmentation and the accompanying insufficiency of land, the ways in which the transition to cash cropping and cattle ranching contribute to food insecurity for the Quijos communities, and the need to pursue communal titling of Quijos community lands. And I have a short video here from Lourdes Hipa that will help to explain this. How do I mute the volume? Do I have to go out of the presentation to mute the volume? On the
Just go to a Zoom window and make yourself there.
For the translation, Lourdes is saying when the communities do not have global titleable land, when land titles are granted to individual families, they sell their land. This is one of our greatest worries here in Napo, that we have a lot of territory without global title to land. So right now, one of our struggles is to demand that our public institutions help us so that our territory can be utilized under global land titling. That is, if we hope to preserve much of our territory. And then what she's going to go on to say in the last part of this brief clip, you'll see that the camera kind of pans out over over pasture, and those pasture lands is what she's referring to as kind of a food desert that has resulted from these transformations. So what she says at the end there is that if they don't preserve their territory, people are just going to continue to sell their land and will move further and further into the margins. By this, she means not just the forest margins, because there really aren't reserves that people can flee to, but rather she's talking about socioecological or socioeconomic marginalization. And when that happens, the land is transformed into a desert. And by this, she means, again, a food desert. There are no edible fruits. There are no medicinal plants. This is the reality. As such, Quijos leaders argued that a key priority of the nation and largely a precondition for the creation of Quijos-centered land management plans was the pursuit of global title to community land, a mechanism to protect those lands from further loss and fragmentation. The second set of workshops was renamed the Foro de Mujeres, the Women's Forum. And these workshops focused on women in positions of political leadership, gender-based violence in Quijos, violence in Quijos communities, and women's unique ancestral knowledge. Activities included an extended roundtable discussion, live music, and cultural presentations. The roundtable discussion featured several of the most prominent female Quijos elders and activists. They spoke extensively about women's ancestral knowledge as tied to productive practices, particularly in the chakras, and about the challenges accompanying patriarchal structures of land ownership and management within the communities. This again dates back to agrarian reform, where land titles were granted to male heads of households, creating a patriarchal private property regime, and it has had direct bearing on the regulation and use of land, with consequences for the capacity of women to maintain their forest gardens and to transmit their gardening knowledge intergenerationally. Thus, the threats to territorial sovereignty posed by extractive industry, the legal mechanisms of land titling, and the stressors of economic marginalization in Indigenous communities is exacerbated by the gendered nature of decision-making around property and territory. The economic division of labor in key host communities remains such that men are most likely to engage in cash cropping and to seek short-term contracts and informal labor arrangements with oil and mining companies, while women are more likely to be dedicated to their chakras and other subsistence practices oriented towards the domestic economy. This often makes men less vocal in their resistance to activities of extractive corporations or informal mining operations, as they find an albeit small source of income as day laborers through these activities. And I witnessed this a number of years ago as Atlantic Richfield Corporation was in the process of building a pipeline to transport crude oil out of the Amazon. The pipeline was going to pass through numerous key host communities, and all attempts to organize unified resistance to the construction of the pipeline and to draw attention to the real health and environmental threats that it represented, both within individual communities and across the Federation of Indigenous Communities, quickly dissolved when the company negotiated labor contracts for male heads of households of each community located along the future path of the pipeline. For the community I was researching in at the time, the compensation received from Atlantic Richfield was 15 days of employment at $5 a day, leading the men from the community to not only acquiesce to the company's plans of having the pipeline pass adjacent to the community, but to actually assemble the stretch of the pipeline that passed adjacent to their community. Roxana Tangila and Lourdes Hipa spoke of the challenges stemming from men exercising greater decision-making authority around uses of private property and decisions affecting community lands. As they suggest, this represents an additional challenge to the integrity of key host territory, as men are more likely to pursue short-term economic interests that may compromise the family's land base. In fact, pressing economic needs regularly compel male heads of households to sell a portion of the family's property, or to receive payment in exchange for allowing illegal gold miners to work on their land without consulting female kin or contemplating the consequences of land fragmentation for the chakra economy. Roxana Tangila discusses how some of the older chakra mamas or women gardeners who remain dedicated to their forest gardens find themselves vulnerable to threats by younger men in the community who choose to concession off their land to gold miners. Even more, the miners once established and working on those lands regularly steal food from the chakras for their personal consumption, or in the case of cacao, harvest it to then sell in the marketplace for additional income. Given the immediacy of the economic need, key host male heads of households often do not consider the broader and longer-term implications of dividing property for the nation's territorial integrity. Individual property titles makes the nation susceptible to internal divisions and land loss, as individual families can choose to sell part or all of their land, make concessions to mining companies, or potentially lose their land to the banks without oversight from the community as a whole. Leaders like HIPAA recognize that precarious land tenure systems and limited territorial sovereignty exacerbate the socioeconomic marginalization that is a consistent feature of life for members of the key host nation. This in turn accelerates environmental degradation and contributes to the erosion of Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledge, as members of the key host nation are literally losing control of the territorial base through which they can enact their livelihood in accordance with their IKS and tech. IKS and tech are unlikely to be activated outside of appropriate relationships to the land, let alone in a context of precarious territorial sovereignty. The consequence has been a steady erosion of traditional forest management practices and forest gardens, and with that, a decline in the IKS and tech associated with it. The last of the workshops, and a slightly more optimistic theme perhaps, is that of the chakras, forest gardens, and knowledge. The gardening workshops were land-based and were conducted in a forest garden belonging to a key host family in one of the member communities of the key host nation. The utility of land-based workshops and knowledge exchange was apparent from the beginning. As we arrived to the chakra where the workshops would be held, the participants quickly fanned out around the roughly 5-hectare garden space, bringing back with them a wide variety of foods that complemented the limited foods we had carried with us. So on the left of the screen, you see Lourdes Hipa, who saw a hot chili pepper plant and kind of dashed off in one direction to gather chili peppers. But other members of the workshop fanned out and harvested manioc and plantains and a wild peanut variety, taro, fruits including papaya and citrus fruits, and very quickly this kind of filled out the what looked like a very meager meal, transformed a very meager meal into quite an abundant feast that we had a couple hours later. Ultimately, after this food was gathered, the participants quickly turned to cooking and prepared maito, a traditional dish consisting of fish cooked in bihao leaves and stuffed with different vegetables and herbs. The ease with which they gathered the food to prepare the feast for 25 people points to how the chakra and surrounding forest are understood as spaces of abundance, and that the chakra system should not be thought of in terms of meeting basic subsistence needs, but rather in terms of being capable of providing for people in an expansive sense. As those present busied themselves with food preparation, the women seamlessly began sharing stories of the chakras and the ancestral knowledge associated with them. After sharing the abundant meal, the chakra mamas invited all participants in a manioc planting demonstration as a means of sharing ancestral planting techniques and the associated ritual and ceremonial knowledge. In the video clip that I'm about to share with you, several of the chakra mamas are demonstrating ancestral techniques of planting manioc, the cornerstone of not only the Quijos diet and cuisine, but also Quijos sociality. Each woman demonstrates the use of leaves of a different plant to help prepare the manioc shoots for planting. The leaves they employ for this ritual come from the taro plant. So Rosalina Aguinda will be presenting first, and she's the one in kind of the center of the screen. She's holding taro leaves. She employs a taro plant, and then Antonia Cerda, who is front and center in a pink top, is going to use a plant called Chiquipanga, which I don't know the translation for. Each of these are fast-growing plants that produce abundant tubers. The ritual is to help ensure that the manioc they are planting will acquire the qualities of these other plants in terms of growth and productivity. The women also speak of the importance of women's mystical powers and knowledge, referred to as pahu in Shilipano or the Quijos language, that permits an accomplished chakra mama to communicate with the spirits of the plants and the garden. In Amazonian indigenous gardening practices, female gardeners attract the spirits to them by telling them beautiful words and by singing them songs that are encoded with specific enchantments to the garden spirits and their plants. These are passed down matrilineally from mother to daughter to granddaughter. Also, as you'll see at the very end of the video, Lorelei Siebel washes her hands after she completes planting of one of the manioc shoots. And this is to ensure that the manioc will not have thick skin and it will be easy to peel when it's ready for harvest. And so I'll play the video in its entirety. Much of it are these ritual incantations that I've just described to you. So. it was great to watch all of the younger participants with their cell phones out recording various parts of this. Because the chakra workshop had concrete pedagogical goals for those who were gathering. And so the older women were sharing their gardening knowledge with the younger ones who may not have been immersed in the chakra economy from a young age, which speaks to kind of this land degradation and the decline of the chakra system. In fact, Roxana Tanguila told her own story of how she was discouraged from engaging in the chakra as a child because her mother saw no future. This despite the fact that her mother was an accomplished gardener in her own right. So when as a young adult, Roxana requested land from her mother to start her own chakra, her mother provided her the poorest land that they possessed as further discouragement from engaging in the chakra economy. But through Roxana's own persistence and the knowledge she's been gifted by other chakra mamas, she was able to make that garden grow. The workshops at the chakra made clear the multiple ways in which the chakras provide for the Quijos in an expansive sense, as a source of abundant food, medicines, building supplies, tools. In essence, the chakra is the cornerstone of the Quijos economy. I want to turn now to the evolution of the partnership in the months since we completed those activities last summer. One of the most important outcomes of the partnership activities to date is the creation of a dedicated research team of the Quijos Nation called Socioecological, or Building from the Forest in Chilipano. It is initially comprised of 4 Quijos researchers and is a product of Maurice Hipa's recognition of the importance of research engagement to help address the needs of the nation. In recent months, it has also led to the growth of the research team to include additional researchers and a new research partner. Thanks to mutual interest, we have commenced planning around an Indigenous nation-to-nation dialogue relating to Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledge, with the goal of facilitating research collaboration between members of the Quijos Nation and members of the Kainai Nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Specifically, we are building a partnership with elders and researchers from the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association, and I'm really happy that Dr. Mike Brewsted is here today as one of the leaders of KIPA, and working to facilitate communication and collaboration among KIPA, the recently created Socioecological research team, and the university researchers. This grew from the invitation to have Lori KIPA present remotely at the annual KIPA Summit in June of last year. In the context of that presentation and subsequent conversations, leaders of HIPA, including Dr. Brewsted, realized the shared purpose of KIPA and Socioecological. We're now in the process of applying for funding to create opportunities for the KIPA and Socioecological research teams to host each other on their traditional territories to begin a dialogue about the historical and contemporary challenges of Indigenous land use and management, and to begin to generate a collaborative research agenda. Much of the existing research on IKS and tech treats those knowledge systems in isolation, running the risk of homogenizing them through an assumption of their interchangeability, or by situating them in dialogue with academics, the non-governmental sector, or conservation organizations from the global north, where the utility of Indigenous knowledge is often condensed to that of validating Western scientific theories. We hope to facilitate a novel epistemological space by bringing together Indigenous peoples with different historical perspectives, but who have identified commonalities in their colonial and post-colonial past and present, in research collaboration leading to innovative approaches to Indigenous-led land use planning and policymaking, and ultimately the design and implementation of Indigenous Quijos and Kainai life plans. The last thing that I want to do very briefly is reflect a little bit, share a few thoughts a little bit about how this subsequent pursuit of research funding to start to build out this partnership has raised for us some questions and observations about the funding research structures as and how those relate to equitably including Indigenous researchers in research collaboration. Increasingly, funding agencies have worked to validate Indigenous knowledge within their research programs in an effort to correct historical wrongs and the marginalization of Indigenous researchers from dominant structures of knowledge production. And this is a really positive development, and one that we hope we will continue to see progress. At the same time, there are still constraints. For example, some funding agencies do not permit co-applicants or collaborators to be paid salaries through the grants, assuming that applicants and collaborators on research grants must hold academic or other professional positions. Yet this is not the case for the Socioecological research team, who are economically precarious and who would rely on salaries from research grants in order to be able to dedicate their time to research, time that they would otherwise have to spend in other income generating activities. One way around this one possible way around this might be to not list Indigenous research partners as co-applicants or collaborators on the grants. But this, however, leads to a contradiction. While granting agencies wish to acknowledge the value of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous researchers would not be able to build their record of funding achievement, curtailing the ultimate goal of promoting future research sovereignty. A possible next step to creating a more equitable, inclusive research funding structure then might be to permit Indigenous applicants and collaborators and other researchers from historically marginalized communities the opportunity to be paid research stipends or salaries from grants when they do not hold academic or professional positions that would permit them to conduct research within the framework. And last, I want to acknowledge the many different people who are involved in the research team and who have helped move it forward. From Sachawana, Lourdes Hipa, Roxana Tanguila, Gonzalo Alvarado, and Gisela Yumbo, those are the 4 members of the Sachawana research team. From the Kipa research team, Dr. Mike Brucehead, William Singer III, Carolyn Russell, and Amanda Fox, the 4 members of the Kipa research team collaborating on this work. At the Universidad San Francisco in Quito, Florencia Delgado, and Andrea Cuellar from here at the Prentice Institute and the University of Lethbridge. And last but not least, I would like to thank again and acknowledge the support received from the Prentice Institute in order to conduct this work. Thank you.
Are you okay to manage Zoom and field questions from there? Or do I have to get up?
No, you don't really get it.
It's so far along, all the way over there. I never fit here.
I will do my very best to do that.
Being lit from my good side, it's great.
So is this do people in online, are they allowed to speak? Or-
No, it's webinars, and it's
webinar, so
webinars,
they
so
write
the
in
chat,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so if you do have questions online, I'm happy to receive them through the chat.
Here's the
And looks
question.
like there might be one already. That was old. Thank you, Beth. Beth says when we mute the computer, we can't hear the video. It was supposed to be the opposite. When we
Yeah,
tested
when
it
we
the other
tested.
day, we had to mute the computer in order for it to be audible online. So I apologize for that. And also questions from all of you as well.
Oh, I can't read that. I think it says I have
No questions.
no questions now. Okay, that's easy for you.
It is.
Not necessarily a question, but very almost exact, the similarities of the colonial government, Indian affairs in Canada. And just a quick thing, in 1884, everybody was sent to boarding schools in the 3 or 4 generations of farming, planting, gardening, chickens, all that. No reading, numeracy, literacy, and language out of the way. And so in 1964, between 1884 and 1964, the blood tribe, and I'll just speak for the blood tribe, started getting very prosperous in cattle ranching, horse, sheep, everything. And in 1964, the federal government had the idea that if the blood tribe was too overly economic self-sufficient, that they would not listen to the government anymore, and that they'll have their own funding and they won't come to us for funding. And so we got, control them. So in 1964, similar to the Gills, what they went through, the Indian agent advised all the national banks to quit giving farm loans and for seeding and fertilizer. So in 1964, it changed, and Indian Affairs allowed the non-native farmers from off the reserve to begin farming. And it was just small portions. And each year, more land got cultivated, more to what we have now in 2025. Up to this time, especially in 2000 to now, the average takeout of the non-native farmer is between 26 and $25 million per year. Like this fall, and there's still grain being hauled out, and the tribe is has only 1/3, so 2/3. So I tell people, walk around that you're like millionaires, even though we don't have the money, but that's how much, the surrounding communities, the farm communities, the farmers, and it's gone into corporate farming. And we have farmers that are farming huge sections of land, and just 1/3, they take 2/3, and even more than that, we're probably getting 1/4. So exactly what happened to them is what happened to us. And the oil and gas, we didn't have our own oil and gas office on the flood reserve, and all the gas at the timber limits and the flood reserve, the old oil and gas wells to now, all that money made is banked by the Indian Oil and Gas office in Calgary, Western Canada, and that money is given to Treasury Board, and some of the wheat money is given to Treasury Board. And so when we apply to get our own money, we have to go through Ottawa to Treasury Board to get that money, whether it's farming or from the oil and gas proceeds, to get our own money back, and they never give us all of it back. The money that we lose out on has created jobs off the reserve, has created and is paying for the bureaucrats, of Indian affairs regionally and nationally. And so when people say you're getting free education, that's not true. The students' tuition here is from the money we're making, except it comes from Ottawa. So the colonial practice is still totally alive. And I could see their frustration and encroachment. The only thing that we don't have, like in Montana, the checkered system, they were given land, and some of them did sell, but a lot of that was given to non-native ranchers and farmers. On the Alberta side, flood reserve side, we cannot sell the land. But it doesn't even matter because we can't even farm our own land. I can't farm my own land. I'm into cattle ranching, and I've sold out because there's no subsidies for the drought and all that. So even though I paid for my own, and so the cattle ranching, the loans come from Indian Business Corporation, which is like the Indian lender, because the banks will not give me any money as a cattle rancher, even though I've proven myself for 38 years. And so those inequities are still alive and well. And, just listen to all that. It's like, I'm from there or they're from here. We're going through the same thing.
The parallels are striking.
Exactly the same, and it's frustrating.
Yeah, the parallels are really striking, and though the situation there in many ways is even worse in the sense that the kind of compensation that they receive for extractive industry on their territory is nothing. It's almost laughable. There's a chart that the oil companies use when they say build a pipeline through a community, and an avocado tree is worth this much money, and a hectare of whatever cultivated plant is worth that much money, and it's pennies. It's a very small amount of money. When you start thinking about, we're talking about decades of production that are lost, right? And you give them $5 for a tree that's being destroyed as they go through their territory.
And some of the farmers that have been farming since the 40s, and I won't name any because it's green, they have donated huge amounts to the city of Lethbridge, college, university, whatever. And here we just barely getting by, brand new college, Red Crow College, with our own money, no donations given back, or foundation, startup costs. Because I would like to see not only a college, but, their own university. Then the question becomes accreditation. Everybody's saying no, 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 because there's money in all institutions, it's, and that's what I want to bring out and talk about on my Native Awareness Week, the second presentation. The history of post-secondary education and what is it now? And why are Native colleges having a great difficulty of, and the only one is the First Nations University is in Regina, but they're located off the reserve. So does that mean I could do a university across the road there because it's off the reserve? I don't know. But it's all about resources and extraction and the benefits from that. They're not benefiting from their own resources, like we're not benefiting from our resources. So I tell people I'm a millionaire, I just don't have the money, because we should be very wealthy on the blood reserve. We should not even have a golf gardens reserve over there. But that's just the whole machinery of colonization that is still there. And I think, okay, when is truth and reconciliation going to hit the farming, the agricultural sector and all that? Sure, it has come into the institutions, truth and reconciliation. Well, when are you going to tell the truth to reconcile? And people, I don't touch that, don't talk about that. But it has to happen. And so I can feel for those people, at the bottom, and the racism and everything.
That's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the potential of this research partnership with Keepa and with Socioecological, because you're identifying these connections. They're identifying these connections and the opportunity to work together collaboratively over how to address some of them, hopefully transformational ways. I think it's really exciting. So really grateful that both groups are interested.
It's been 13 years I formalized Keepa, kind of like the protection agency. I stuck my neck out and I'm still sticking it out, but there's a lot of people supporting me and a lot of people, that in environmental and getting doctorates and masters and all that. We have the know-how, but now let's, we gotta formalize it and whatever. So June 11th, 12th, and 13th, and if they come over, it'll be wonderful for our 11th Keepa Summit, because it's COVID, all that we lost. So it's been 13 years I've been working at this, looking at the blood reserve and large amount of farmland cultivated, and the animals and the birds. I'm but the only big piece of grassland left. So I have abundant of badgers and deer and even antelopes coming back. Nothing in the fields, And I get worried about the chronic wasting disease, the prions, the birds eating those animals that have the chronic wasting and the prions. And there's studies done that if the prions are so amounting, not only on blood reserve, but all over Alberta, the farming communities in Western Canada, if those prions are contaminated, get into the grains and the cereals and all that, it's going to contaminate that. And so there's a study, $1 trillion loss, if all wheat fields get wiped out, but nobody thinks like that because it's all about money.
Excuse myself, I'm so sorry. I do have some questions for you, but I will ask them to you down in the department later. Okay, thank you so much, Patrick.
So do you go down there every year, and do they come up there too? That doesn't work.
So this is a new initiative that we're working on. So to date, nobody from Socioecological has been here yet. That's our one of our more immediate goals is to try to start these exchanges. Many years ago, Gonzalo Alvarado, who's a member of the Socioecological team, was an invited guest of the university. That was in 2011. But in the current moment, we haven't yet. excuse me, in an earlier phase of my life, I was in Ecuador every year, and now it's not quite as easy with
Oh,
money and
those-
childcare.
Those fast, loose and fancy free days, huh?
Yeah, so, and there was a big gap with COVID. The Indigenous and zoning communities closed themselves off to the world. And which is absolutely what they should have done, and nobody was allowed in the communities for a couple of years. So, I was there in 2018, I was gonna go in 2020, something happened in the world. And I was just back last summer for the first.
I think, Patrick, and thank you for this presentation. It's really great to see both the content and the connections and the reciprocity that is being built, right, around food, but also around place. I think it's very important, if possible, to bring some of your partners from Ecuador here. And so if there are ways that we can facilitate that, I'm happy to support that.
Oh, I think that's amazing, thank you. We are applying for funding and we haven't had tremendous success yet, as I think you know. Despite getting really positive evaluations of our applications, but the message with this is a great project here.
But
$0.
yeah. I think if it works for June, or leaving that up to the detail up to you guys, I think we're in a space where it makes a lot of sense to continue to build this relationship.
Oh, thank you. That's true.
And I can say, I don't want to speak for some of my previous partners and connections in other parts of Canada, but there are other communities that feel and are living exactly the same thing. The industry changes, might be forestry, might be fisheries, right? They're the same dynamics definitely exist, whether it's the Marshall decision in the Maritimes, or comparable issues in northern BC. So there's a lot of residents here. There's a lot of people asking the same questions. And I think they are critical on a number of different fronts. So yeah, we should follow up.
Wonderful, thank you, appreciate
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
You know, just to add to that, let's say the 26 million was ours. Actually, Southern Alberta would prosper, really, more so than right now, Lethbridge, Cardston, or McLeod, but I don't want to name out any church group, but the LDS and the Indian agents really collaborated on that. Because a lot of the machinery was being bought in Cardston, and then overnight, nobody could buy a tractor, seeders, cultivators. Now get this, I could go to any bank here to buy a tractor, they will not give me a loan. But I could go there, buy a truck and car, yes. And it's still like that. This is 2025. I can't buy a tractor. Even a small one, to farm.
Yeah.
And they can say, well, you don't have enough collateral and the reserve does not have any collateral. I do have collateral. And so the 1964 mandate that the federal government, through the Indian agents that were doing all these reports, hey, they're starting to not listen to us, the blood reserve. We got to put a stop to it. And that's what they did. So the federal government went to the head offices of all the banks down east and to their subsidiary banks, no more farm loans. So there's no farm loans. But the thing, I might be jumping the gun. Imagine if we had a Gil and Kipa Institute here. That would be so amazing.
So if we want to project forward 10 years, this is what we want to see is that each research team has their own institute on their traditional
Yeah.
territory.
Not at the university or
Not at the
college.
university.
Land-based
Land-based, yeah, yeah.
research.
A land-based, a sovereign research institution. I mean, that's if, I don't know if I'll be retired when that happens or not, but if that happens before I retire, then I can,
For
put my
years,
feet up happily.
for
Like the
years,
rest of life,
lack
the
of a
station.
better word, I've been, the last 10, 15 years, needs to be or Socioecological to be institute. I've been thinking about it, and it has to happen. Same thing, I'm not always be young. It has to happen, an institute. And again, you're right. And I was joking around with past president, by Patterson up here. There's that grassland. I was telling him, yeah, is this the little piece? I'm gonna turn it into my reserve. The past president said, huh? Imagine I was gonna just push the envelope. This is now the NAPBC's reserve, you know. Who's gonna contest it because we're always saying, welcome to acknowledging to the land of the Blackfoot people. Well, I wanna make a reserve now.
So we're getting on tangents a little bit here, but for those of you who don't know, and the process by which this happened is a little bit murky as far as I can tell. The board created a University of Lethbridge Business Corporation, which is in the process of designing plans to develop the remaining South Campus as a real estate development to generate revenue for the institution. Why this is murky is that we can't confirm that this went through the proper channels of General Faculties Council when it was created a number of years ago. But what if that land was used instead as a space for research and a space for land-based teaching and a space for thinking about food security for students having urban gardens and things like that, rather than just creating another real estate development?
See, the ironic thing, I'm just here 2 days a week or 14 hours, whatever. I've been teaching for University of Calgary for 6 years, off campus, every other Saturday, land-based learning in Bominka. I had a class, I go to free spaces. I'm bringing the class to Buffalo Jump, a whole bunch of elders I can talk, you know. And so 6 years, nobody didn't offer me that over here. So the next best thing, well, why don't you be the academic elder? Oh, okay, sure, I'll take it. That way I don't have to, you know. So imagine 6 years ago, the Blood Reserve elders, they didn't come here, and I don't know why. They went to Calgary and told the president, we want better teachings for our people. We give you a lot of money, tuition. We want something that they could learn, that they could bring back home, you know. And so Calgary listened, and that's how this program started. So I don't know the elders of that time, why they went to UFC. They didn't come to U of A or U of L or U of A. They didn't, or Mount Royal. I was like, what drew them to there? But Calgary listened. And so I'm not trying to say anything here or start anything, but all I'm saying is, why did the elders go over there? Did they feel there would be more, you know, collaboration and working together? And they called me too. I didn't apply for that job. Can you teach this course? And there's several courses under those. And so I've been teaching for Calgary, and yet, so kind of like, I want to come home, but I guess 2 days a week's not too bad. Kind of home, I think, you know. So, and again, land-based learning. That's the big thing. And you cannot learn land-based learning just sitting inside a building. That's why, so I got this class land-based, and then to Waterton, to writing on stone, and because of the new government, I was going to bring up the Bear Gulch in a place that has 800 TP rings, southwest of Shoto, Montana, and all the petroglyphs. The Bear Gulch east of Lewiston, Montana is the second writing on stone, 3,000 petroglyphs, over 5,000 to 8,000 years old. We're not new people here, you know, and for the mountain tops of Bachtel, particularly Waterton, they flew me up there, and there's one over 12,000-year-old Vision Quest Blackfoot, Ice Age, and it's there. And as I'm saying, there's so much to offer. That's why I keep looking at that Prentice Institute. I would like to have a Guyana or Kiva Institute with combination of partners. That's my dream.
There's not a model, but there's something similar that Albert Medina Marshall at Escazone, Albert is an elder, right?
I know, I've been to Escazone, yeah.
So they have the Umagi Institute there, and it sort of started a long time ago as maybe more community development oriented at one point. But there are, UNBC has tried a couple of things as well. There are definitely some lessons to learn.
Yeah, I think we need to do something here. Not particularly here, but close by. Close
Today.
by.
That's done.
Yeah,
I don't have that kind of power.
I'll give it to you.
Okay. I think we're out of time. I really cannot read that Zoom at all, so,
People are just thanking.
yeah, yeah. Thank you to everybody who came today. Thank you for joining us. Victoria, you didn't get a chance to practice your Spanish. Well, you missed it. So, next time.
If you can hang around, I'll play videos.
But yes, thank you, Patrick and Andrea and everybody who's been involved. And yeah, I think this is something we need to continue to push in different ways. And I'm happy to support this again.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's wonderful. Thanks for the invitation.
Also, can you bring some of the fish with the claro and the manioc? Because I haven't had lunch. That looked very, very good.
You, I guess I'm gonna end this. for those
Is the
of you who are-
recording?
Oh, everyone's gone, sorry. Do I need to do anything with the recording? Yes.
Oh, or just send the meeting. Oh, well, no, because we don't ask if you want to see it.
Yeah, it's like a video.